Okay, let me share the story of the $14,400 miracle seed. As you may recall, I committed my life to Jesus in January 2001, got involved with the FCA a few months later, and was spending about an hour per day on average in my quiet time that first year. Early in 2002, while in a weekly coaching group meeting with 3 other leaders, one of the men challenged each of us to write down our 5 to 10-year goals. I wrote down that I wanted to bump my daily quiet time from 1 hour to 4 hours within 10 years. That's because Pastor Mark Jarvis, who led me to a personal relationship with Jesus, told me that Martin Luther in the 1500s was so busy that he had to spend at least 4 hours of quiet time each day to get his work done. A month or 2 later, our church began a 3-month spiritual journey. It was during this time that the Lord prompted me to increase my daily quiet time from 1 hour to 2 hours per day on average. In the fall of 2002, Holy Spirit led me to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes gathering at the Cove, or Billy Graham Training Center in Asheville, North Carolina. I had never been to Asheville before, but this just so happened this was the first time in the 48-year history of the FCA that they had all their leaders come back together, and I happened to be there. At this FCA retreat, I met Doug Barclay, who had come up from Atlanta, Georgia with a friend, even though he was not even involved in the FCA. Doug shared his life story and dream of wanting to step away from his full-time job in the marketplace to go to work full-time with Operation Mobilization, a global ministry started about 50 years earlier. As a result of our conversation, Doug ended up leaving his full-time job 2 months later. In late 2002, I set a written goal of working 12 to 16 weeks as an anesthesiologist in 2003. Before the year ended, I was scheduled to work 1 week in January, 2 weeks in February, and 1 week in March of 2003. It seemed my plans were working out perfectly. Then God threw a curveball. In January 2003, the head anesthesiologist in Radford asked me to work 4 weeks in a row starting in late January. Accepting that assignment would mean being away from home for 7 straight weeks, except on weekends. I knew I needed to consider this request because the anesthesia group in Radford had treated me the best. So I told the anesthesiologist I would get back to him in a week or so after discussing this with my wife and praying about the situation. My wife said yes, and the Lord confirmed that decision in my heart. So I called that anesthesiologist back, accepting his offer. When I mentioned that I had increased my daily charge from $1,000 per day to $1,200 per day, he gladly agreed to pay me that. Now I started to make plans for the extra $24,000 I would be earning with the extra 4 weeks of work. However, God had other plans for this money. In early February 2003, Doug Barclay called me out of the blue to ask if he could visit me on his way to his old church in Ohio. Doug told me he had left his full-time job with his daughter in college and his son going to college in another year and a half. I told Doug I was going to be away from home working in Woodstock, Virginia, but he still decided to visit me there. After my workday in the operating rooms, I took Doug out for dinner. Doug shared his story about stepping out in faith. When I asked him how much his biggest donor had pledged, he told me $100 per month. Doug also told me he could not start drawing a paycheck until he had raised his entire year's salary in pledges. I told God in private that he was Doug's provider, not me. At that time, I had a negative cash flow and was using money up from my IRA. I told God I would be glad to make connections for Doug, but not a financial pledge. Within a few days, Holy Spirit began working on me. 3 extraordinary things happened, all related to extravagant giving in a span of 24 hours. One day, I left my Bible at the hospital where I was working. So the next morning, I ended up reading the book called The Blessed Life instead. In that book, the author shares numerous stories of extravagant giving. In the past, this pastor, the author, had given away about 9 cars, his house, and other things. And each time he gave something away, amazing things happened. He was never able to outgive God. The Lord made it clear that he wanted me to sow something financially into Doug Barclay's life. So I started to negotiate with God. Have you ever negotiated with God? Don't bother. He always wins. Here's how my negotiation started. I said, okay, God, I will pledge $100 per month to Doug. That's what his biggest donor has pledged. Over a year, that would be $1,200, which is what I was earning in a day. Holy Spirit told me that's not enough. I then said, okay, Lord, I will pledge $500 per month or $6,000 in a year, which is what I'm earning in a week. Holy Spirit said, that's not enough. Then I said, I'll pledge $1,200 per month or $14,400 over 12 months. God said, that's perfect. Now call Doug and tell him. When I called Doug to share this story, he at first told me he could not accept my large pledge because he knew I had a negative cash flow. However, I told Doug the Lord had made it clear this was the amount I was to sow, and I was afraid not to obey. Amazingly, the amount I pledged was the exact amount to the dollar that Doug needed to begin working full-time for Operation Mobilization and drawing his monthly salary. While I didn't know how much Doug needed, God did. And Doug's first day at his new work was 03/03/03. And that miracle ultimately led to other miracles on 04/04/04, 05/05/05, and 07/07/07. So my uncommon seed of obedience resulted in a whole snowball effect of extraordinary miracles. The fruit from my financial seed was enormous and manifested quickly. 7 months later, I was offered my highest paying, easiest, most enjoyable anesthesia job of my career at a hospital I didn't even know existed. In the fall of 2003, I began earning $180,000 per year, working just 2.5 days per week. In December 2006, I stepped away from my best anesthesia job ever to take a sabbatical year in obedience to Holy Spirit. I started 2007 with a 21-day fast. While journaling during my quiet time on that first day, Holy Spirit told me that 12 people were going to sow a $14,400 miracle seed into my life, my company, and God's billion-soul vision. My parents agreed to do so on that same day. A year and a half later, on June 12, 2008, Bob Sims from Austin, Texas, obeyed Holy Spirit and became the second person to sow a $14,400 miracle seed into my life. That's a whole nother miracle story by itself. But Bob's seed ultimately led to 2 different tribes taking our Web 2.0 course. 2 of those people were Bertha Hinson and Nancy Slocum. Nancy eventually became the lead intercessor for Team Destiny 777, a catalyst for God's billion-soul vision. And Bertha chose to become the third person to sow a $14,400 miracle seed in the fall of 2009. She sowed her seed in faith, believing it would lead to the transformation of Richmond, Virginia, and we're starting to see that happen. Judy Reed became the fourth person to sow a $14,400 miracle seed in April 2010. Her seed birthed a 12 Women, 12 Weeks, 12 Destinies coaching program led by Carrie Stone, and eventually led to Carrie completing her first book, Defeating Fear. I firmly believe that 8 more people are going to sow a $14,400 miracle seed into my life and God's billion-soul vision in early 2011. Let me go ahead and ask Michael Oswald about his thoughts on this.
Well, Joseph, as you like to say, I'm getting Holy Spirit tingles listening to this story. And that number 12 is a pretty important number in the Bible and, of course, in God's creation. So I'm just, I'm all aglow thinking about all that he's going to do with those seeds that he is sowing.
Thank you, Michael. Incidentally, as I mentioned earlier, Michael and I are planning to coach at least 4,095 CEOs over a 12-month period of time. We are going to ask each CEO to invest $1,200 per month for 12 months or $14,400 in a year. $14,400 is not just another number. It is a miracle seed intimately woven into God's billion-soul vision. We expect that each of these CEOs will see at least a 30, 60, or 100-fold increase in their impact in 12 months. Holy Spirit has laid out His business plan and strategy. Perhaps He is inviting you into something big. Let us hear from Virginia Morton. She has seen some of the fruit from these $14,400 miracle seeds that were sown.
Yes, I have been able to witness all that's happened through the seeds that that Bob and Bertha and Judy have sown, and it's just been phenomenal to watch the Lord at work. But I truly want to stand in agreement with you that the CEOs are going to sow these seeds in that you're calling for, right now into what you're doing. It's right on the horizon. It's happening. It's beautiful to watch.
Thank you, Virginia. I really appreciate that. As you were sharing, I was filled with Holy Spirit tingles. In early December 2009, Holy Spirit instructed me to host 3 different webinars on 3 consecutive Saturdays. He gave me the titles, dates, and times for each webinar. One of those webinars on December 12, 2009 was called the $14,400 Miracles. Because I did not have much notice to prepare for this webinar, we had only about 8 to 10 people live on that webinar, along with 7 panelists. During this webinar, Doug Barclay shared some amazing stories of fruit resulting from the $14,400 seed my wife and I sowed into his life several years earlier. Within a week of doing that webinar, someone sowed a $75,000 financial seed into Doug Barclay's life. This was more than Doug's annual salary of $48,000 per year. God is a God of order and numbers. Numbers mean something to Him. And $14,400 is a miracle seed that unlocks enormous favor.